Ready to experience some of the oldest bourbon barrels in Kentucky? That's the question Heaven Hill asked when talking about Elijah Craig 18 single barrel. Today's review on the Mash and Drum. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room. I am Jason C. Thanks for stopping by. Back in 2015, Heaven Hill announced the return of Elijah Craig 18-year-old bourbon. The whiskey had been away from retail for about 3 years due to so-called inventory shortages. The Elijah Craig 18-year-old single barrel, according to Heaven Hill, was first introduced in 1994. It was one of the oldest single barrel bourbons in the market when it came out. When Heaven Hill originally released this whiskey, it was touted as the oldest single barrel bourbon in the world. Its cult status and shortage prior to the 2015 release has tripled this bourbon's retail price. With yearly releases, no other brands match Heaven Hill's track record of continually releasing high-aged bourbon. At one time, Heaven Hill released 20, 21, and 22-year-old single barrels, but those have been discontinued. Along with the 18, Heaven Hill does offer a 23-year and also a 27-year. The Elijah Craig 18-year is bottled at 90 proof, has a mash bill of 78% corn, 12% malted barley, 10% rye, and has a retail price of around $130. Now, while I take a pour, I want you to have a closer look. All right, guys, so now that you've had a closer look at the bottle, this was one of those bottles that I've seen in stores and it's come in, or I've either seen it on the shelves and it's been overpriced. I've always passed on it. I was able to get this bottle at MSRP, so I finally pulled the trigger. So let's see how it is on the nose. That is a lot of oak and caramel up front. That's the first thing that jumps out of the glass. You get a ton of oak, obviously, with that 18-year age statement. And a lot of caramel too. There's like a Werther's Original candy jumping out of the glass here. Next thing I'm getting is honey, cinnamon, good amount of citrus on the nose too. I am getting some orange peel here. There's definitely like a floral or minty quality to it as well that I'm getting on the nose here. But yeah, the overwhelming scent here is that oak and the tannins, maybe a little bit of leather, tobacco. You know, some of those notes that you get typically on an older bourbon, something that's over 15 years old. Get a little bit of chocolate too, I think, which is nice. That chocolate and mint combination that kind of underlies the oak is actually kind of nice. I mean, overall, it's pretty oaky. It smells kind of dry, but I think the 90 proof doesn't really help it too much. Remember, it is watered down. It's only 90 proof. Smells a little bit thinner on the nose than I would like. Not as robust as I thought from an 18-year, so let's go to the palate, see what we get. Cheers, guys. Well, not surprising, the front of the palate is very vanilla. There's a ton of vanilla influence coming from all those years in the barrel. A lot of caramel, ton of oak. I mean, there's just a lot of oak spice here. Only 90 proof, so it's a little bit thin on the mouthfeel. I'm trying to kind of swirl it around, get a good feel for it. Let's go for another sip here. Cheers. Yeah, same as the nose, a little bit of honey, a little leather. It does have some spice to it. I am getting a nice little rye punch on the very back end. A little bit of rye kick, maybe some of that mint is kicking in too. Cinnamon, definitely some baking spices that are lingering, but more oak and vanilla and caramel that's really overtaking the whole experience here. Again, something typical that you might get with an 18-year. The only thing that's not driving me nuts here is like the mouthfeel on this. It's just at 90 proof, it's just coming across very, not super thin, but not as oily as I would like for a bourbon this old. Let's go for another sip. Okay, so on that sip, those lingering sweet flavors are starting to be overtaken now by the oak. The oak presence, the more you sip it, once this bourbon starts flattening out and your palate starts getting used to it, first and second sips on this, I think, wow, this could be a pretty damn good bourbon. Man, by the third sip now, the oak just really kind of takes over the entire palate. You are getting the typical vanilla and caramels here as well, but the oak is really the dominating force. I feel like when you proof something down this far, an 18-year-old, you're probably doing one of two things. One, with all the water you're adding, obviously you're just stretching it out to try to make more bottles to sell at 90 proof. But also, I think, maybe adding all that water to it, maybe hide some of the bitterness and some of the oakiness that's also in there as well, which is much appreciated, but also you could kill some other flavors, I think. Let's go for another sip here. The more I sip this, the less interesting it's getting, which is unfortunate. I mean, this is a really easy sipping 18-year-old bourbon, I'll give it that. Remember, they are single barrel, so depending on what bottle you have or what barrel you may have that's in your bottle, we could have a different experience here. This one is pretty oaky. It's not as oaky as I thought it was gonna be, but at the same time, the oak flavor is really kind of overtaking everything else in the bourbon. I mean, there is a lot of vanilla, a lot of caramel, your typical bourbon notes, but at 90 proof and being as thin as it is on the palate, I just kind of want more from it. Let's go for another sip. Okay, so on that last sip, this is what I'm getting here. You're getting that nice little punch of vanilla and oak on the front of the palate. You get a little bit of spice there on the sides of your tongue, which is nice. But then once it hits mid-palate, it just really thins out, just becomes very oaky. You still get a little bit of honey there. On the back end, you get a little spark of that mint, some citrus, but really just oak all the way through. Oak, oak, oak. A little bit of vanilla, a little bit of caramel, like I said, a little bit of citrus. I mean, it's a good solid bourbon, but at 18 years, 130 bucks and only 90 proof, not sure if this was something I would buy again. Let's go to the final breakdown. So first up is price. So this is about 130 bucks retail. Secondary market value puts this at about 160 to 250. For availability, it's limited. This is an annual release and also a limited release that typically comes out in October or December, but depending where you live, this could show up later on or early on the following year. Value. So this was kind of tough, but honestly, when you compare this bourbon to the rest of the market, an 18-year-old bourbon priced at 130 bucks is actually a good value. The majority of limited release bourbons out of Kentucky usually come in between 125 to 200 bucks, and they usually aren't this highly aged or even include an age statement. So now the big question, do I recommend? I would say no. I would say this is a try before you buy. So as I mentioned, I passed on picking up this bottle a few times before I pulled the trigger because I was really able to get this at MSRP. For me, overall, kind of disappointed. I did love it at first, but the more you sip, it just flattens out and gets very uninteresting. I suspected the low proof and 18-year age statement may not fare well for me. My particular palate, considering I prefer higher proof bourbons, especially ones with some age on them. This particular release for me feels like it's still stuck in the 90s in that particular bourbon market. An 18-year age-stated single barrel to me should be really awesome, but 90 proof I think is just too low for today's standards and market, especially when Elijah Craig is putting out their 12-year-old gem, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, for less money and way more flavor than this. Now, I will say that's just personally me, but if you're a bourbon drinker out there that prefers a lower proof bourbon and really likes those oaky barrel notes, then this bourbon would probably be right in your wheelhouse. But for the rest of you out there, give this a try at a friend's house or a bar or even at the distillery before buying this one. It's solid, it's flavorful, it has a nice age statement, but just doesn't excite me. For me, I'm glad I got one, but this is one I probably wouldn't buy again. All right, everyone. Well, thanks for watching the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room for this episode as we reviewed Elijah Craig 18 Single Barrel. If you liked it, hit the subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. If you haven't yet, find me on Instagram and find me on Twitter. Let me know what you think of this one. Do you like it? Is this in your wheelhouse? Did you find it a little bit bland, a little bit thin like I did? Or do you love it? Always love talking to you guys. And as I always say, it is not about the whiskey, it's the people you share it with. So cheers, and I'll see you next time on the Mash and Drum.